The Assembly of First Nations, or AFN, is the top rung of Indigenous governance. Or is it? The AFN is certainly a government-like entity, while not exactly a government per se. According to their website, the AFN is an advocacy organization taking direction and fulfilling mandates as directed by First Nations in Assembly through resolutions. Resolutions that get voted on, just like in a government. But in the case of the AFN, its critics say it's funded by and therefore somewhat beholden to an actual sovereign government, also known as Canada. What the AFN is and what it does is at the heart of some of the struggles that have plagued it, especially in recent years. For a fuller context of where we're at and how we got here, let's go back in time. And what better place to do that than a museum? Before contact and colonization, before the Indian Act, Band Council governments, and the Assembly of First Nations, there was, and is, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and other Indigenous governments. The Haudenosaunee Council is an ancient government, a group originally of 5 Iroquois nations that got together to form a confederacy, now made up of 6 nations.
The basic notion is how do we get together as a group, but stay with a fair amount of autonomy within our individual units. My name is Justin Jennings, so I'm a curator at the Royal Ontario Museum, so I'm the curator of the Archaeology of the Americas here.
As Jennings notes, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is seen as a model for others.
And you look at this on paper, and if you're somebody that's not from the Haudenosaunee, that may be not Indigenous, saying, oh, there's no way this would work. But it has, and it works very, very well for a long time.
Fundamental to the Confederacy is the Great Law of Peace, which for Jennings is reminiscent of spiritual teachings.
So how do you learn the Great Law? The idea is you sit in a longhouse for hours after hours and hear stories about what it's like to be Haudenosaunee, the ways in which you should treat each other, the way you should treat other people.
The Confederacy Council operates through a consensus style of decision-making, one that is starkly different from the European style of majority rule decision-making. Also fundamental to the Haudenosaunee society is the prominent role that women play in it traditionally.
In the early 1600s, you'd find that women, for the most part, controlled most of the daily activities, right? Because it is very much, there's a matriarch that deals with the day-to-day in the longhouse. On a daily life perspective, it was women that were in charge. But what happened in the Haudenosaunee, they said, okay, men, because you're actually coming in and you're marrying into the longhouse, right? Is that you guys should therefore naturally be in charge of the interactions between communities.
And so while women are in charge at the longhouse, the men are smoking tobacco with other men.
You'd have men traveling very widely, doing sweat baths together, smoking pipes together. And it's all about those international relationships.
Indigenous leaders throughout history have seen that in order to have a relationship with Canada, some assembly might be required. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was one of the first. The Assembly of First Nations is one of the most recent. But before the AFN came the National Indian Brotherhood. And the story of the National Indian Brotherhood is largely a story about George Manuel.
When you find 90% of our Indian people in Canada who are in welfare, people who are starving in a very rich country in Canada, to me, is a form of subtle genocide.
He was a sweatmuck leader and a skilled log driver or boom man who emerged from British Columbia to become a national figure. Doreen Manuel is his daughter and worked on an update of the biography of her father.
And it's interesting because he talked his way into these things, like when he was a boom man, back then they only hired First Nations to sweep the floors. They never hired them for any other position. But he talked his way into it. He said, let me go break up that log jam. Let me show you I can do it. And they laughed at him. They thought he was going to get killed out there, but they let him. And when he was successful, really successful, they hired him. And then because of that, he was the first Indigenous person in that area to be able to get a bank loan.
The National Indian Brotherhood formed in 1970. George Manuel was a founder, and later he headed the organization. Its members were the leaders of various provincial and territorial organizations. In 1969, they found a galvanizing focus, the White Paper. Minister of Indian Affairs Jean Chrétien proposed ending the Indian Act and land claims and assimilating First Nations people, essentially making them the same status as other minorities. The White Paper gave the National Indian Brotherhood something to stand against, the federal government.
I really don't believe in selling our Aboriginal rights in terms of cash. I don't even want to take $1 for my Aboriginal rights because I don't think it's for sale. Not for me anyway. I don't want to sell my history. Aboriginal rights is my history. It's my identity. It's my identity with my past. It's my identity with my history. It's my identity with my Great Spirit on all the way down the line.
The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is often described as the oldest participatory democracy on Earth. So cherished in Six Nations that its founder, the great peacemaker, is portrayed with as much reverence as Christ himself in the stained glass of the community's Mohawk chapel. Thank you. All right.
It's not just a church, it's a living symbol of that crown relationship. It was built by George III to replace the one we lost during the American Revolution, and so he gets these coat of arms over the door here at the back. My name is Barry Hill. We're here today at the historic Mohawk Chapel. I act as the warden of the chapel. My own background, I'm Mohawk, Wolf Clan from Six Nations. So in the first window, the central figure is the peacemaker, whose name was the Ganawida. Now, he's not wearing a traditional headdress. I think the attempt was to show the importance of the peacemaker, and it gave him the biggest headpiece.
Is the peacemaker, is he a deity, or is he a human? Or?
Legend has it he actually came from an area which is now Tyendinaga Reserve. They have a monument to that effect. And he came and he arrived in a stone canoe, which immediately set him apart. And he had something of a speech impediment, and he had a fellow with him who spoke on his behalf on many occasions, Hiawatha, who became Hiawatha in poetry later. So the message was that if we were to unite and become under one form of governance and one collective viewpoint, we would be in better shape to resist what was foretold as an incoming disruptive power.
When was this approximately?
At least 500 years before contact.
So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was formed to protect its people from an impending power. Colonization fits with that premonition nicely, doesn't it?
And of course you can see who the puppet is at the bottom. You know, that clearly represents AFN because there's an AFN logo on the coat. And of course you can see who the puppet is at the bottom. You know, that clearly represents AFN because there's an AFN logo on the coat.
Policy analyst Russ Dybo was a special advisor to Roseanne Archibald when she was national chief. He also worked for the National Indian Brotherhood, and in 2018 ran for national chief of the AFN.
Every month I get requests from band councils, and they want an overview of what Trudeau's been doing for the last 8 years, because AFN no longer does that kind of critical analysis.
Dybo has some experience looking at what the federal Liberals are doing. In an earlier life, Dybo worked for them from 1990 to 94.
One of the biggest promises, I think, was we got the Liberal Party to say that a Liberal government would act on the premise that the inherent right to self-government was an existing Aboriginal treaty right within the meaning of Section 35. That was a key promise we thought was in the Red Book and in the platform. Unfortunately, when the Liberals formed a majority government led by Jean Chrétien as Prime Minister, he imposed an inherent right to self-government policy that's basically has preconditions into it that it's an anything but inherent right policy.
The way Dybo sees it, the Liberals haven't stopped trying to end treaty rights since the 1969 White Paper.
They have what I call the Liberal termination doctrine. It basically started with the 1969 White Paper on Indian policy to basically terminate Aboriginal treaty rights. They wanted to remove the legal distinctions between Indians and Canadians by dissolving the Department of Indian Affairs, repealing the Indian Act, amending the Constitution to remove Section 9124 that refers to Indians and Indian lands.
Well, colonizers tried but failed to get rid of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and Leroy Hill knows that because he's part of it.
My name is Hohahis Leroy Hill. I'm the Council Secretary for the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I'm also a faith keeper, and I'm a teacher of language and also a student of our history and our traditions.
We met at the Confederacy's old council house, built in 1863, 4 years before Canada was founded.
So they built this for our government to meet here. Councils functioned here pretty peacefully for quite a while. Before the Indian Act experiment was imposed.
It was at this location in 1924 that the traditional government of the Haudenosaunee first read and rejected the Indian Act.
And they went through every section that I first drafted the Indian Act, and as a united group, the General Indian Council it was called, they sent Six Nations back to tell the federal government, the Crown, that we reject it. And the reasons are enclosed from our minutes.
But the federal government wasn't going to take no for an answer.
So that's when the government Indian agent come with that proclamation, say, there's an order in council dissolving your system of government. So they padlocked this council house and seized control, and they took whatever they could out of here. There was wampums taken and money. That's from my grandfather, who was a sitting chief there.
So the federal government installed an elected band council, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy went somewhere else, but didn't quit.
What happened was our chiefs just went to the longhouse, lit the fire, and says, we're going to council here from now on.
We can't show you inside the longhouse where the Haudenosaunee Confederacy meets today.
It's the last thing left that's sacred to us and special, and it's all uniquely our own. So we want to contain that and control how it's used, and that it's not improper use or portrayed improperly.
Hill says the Confederacy holds true to the great peacemaker's teachings, with principal women and male chiefs participating in governance.
One of the things he done was he proclaimed that there would be principal women that we'll call Iyat Dagwenyo Gayanida. So these titles of office will carry on through the female lines. That's what he done, and he says it come from our mothers, how we got life and breath, and the blood that we have comes from our mothers.
So how did we get from there to here?
Overshadowing the event will be the recent removal of National Chief Roseanne Archibald. At a virtual meeting on June 28th, chiefs voted to remove her as national leader, based on the findings of an external human resources investigation into alleged harassment of AFN staffers.
You can call or text or email your chief and council, and you can ask for two things. One, that they reinstate me as national chief, and two, that they make sure that the forensic audit goes ahead.
I think Roseanne was fighting an uphill battle because she was a woman. There's even women who don't support women.
Not that long ago, the AFN removed National Chief Roseanne Archibald after she suggested a closer look at the organization's finances was warranted.
Well, you know, I wasn't involved. If you're not on the inside, it's really hard to know what was really happening.
The vote to remove Roseanne Archibald was said by the AFN to be related to complaints made by staff against her. But people in Archibald's inner circle told APTN Investigates the complaints were part of a conspiracy to get rid of her. The same source also told us the AFN is largely controlled by Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations, as well as the Liberal Party. They said the AFN is a treadmill for federal funding, with monies not getting to the community level, and that this is what Archibald wanted to change. Russ Dibo backs up some of this.
So she was trying to push more for a rights-based approach instead of a programs approach, you know. But there was pushback, and obviously they removed her.
APTN Investigates was unable to convince ousted National Chief Roseanne Archibald or the current National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Nepinak to speak with us on camera, but we did get Dibo to tell us what he thinks happened to Archibald and what's going on at the AFN.
Well, my observation of it is that she tried to make changes that were resisted amongst the AFN executive and the chiefs that support the executives from the regions. She wanted to have an audit of AFN and what had gone on. So she wanted to see some internal changes, but also in the relationship with the federal government. And I don't think that the Trudeau government wanted those changes.
The government is still playing the same tune, but our leadership has changed and has gotten softer and softer. And now it says it right on the website. It's a advocacy organization.
The criticism of the AFN that it's too chummy with the federal government, which funds it, is not an uncommon one.
They're still implementing the white paper policy, but in pieces. And so that part of the relationship hasn't changed.
A lot of the things they wanted to do in 1969, they've succeeded in doing. When Roseanne was removed, that was it for my relationship with AFN. And that's why I personally think, you know, probably needs to be dissolved, because I don't think it can be reformed to deal with the issues we need to deal with now. Don't count on AFN. That's my message to them. Don't count on AFN.
A better way, suggests Dibo, is to recall the relationship envisioned by the Haudenosaunee.
You know, with the wampum bouts, the two-row wampum, you know, with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, initially with the Dutch and then with the British. And it wound up being described as the covenant chain relationship. The chain symbolizing, you know, the relationship of the two parties on each side.
Making confederacies and making them work, giving that gift of tobacco here, right? Forging that relationship, passing that pipe.
That's how I see the bilateral relationship. What we call the two-row, where the ship, the European ship, goes in one way, and our canoe, right, traveling side by side through time on the river of life. That's where we have to work out the terms of coexistence, coexisting sovereignties.
Our system remains intact. The It's not as strong as it once was. But what government can say that today? Look at the chaos in the world. It makes me feel kind of comfortable. Our government is fairly stable.
Named after former Quebec Premier Maurice Duplessis, the term Duplessis orphan refers to children who in the late 1930s to mid-60s were moved from orphanages to psychiatric hospitals. But the vast majority had no mental illness. And many weren't even orphans in the true sense of the word.
Ma mère a tombé malade et le curé du village avec le médecin, il est venu voir mon père. Puis il a dit à mon père, il dit, les deux petites filles vont être bien avec les sœurs, vont se faire instruire. Puis là, le prêtre, puis le médecin nous a rentré dans son char. Elle nous a poussés dans un char qu'on peut embarquer, puis moi je ne voulais pas embarquer, puis ils m'ont forcé d'embarquer, puis je pleurais tout le temps pour ma mère.
It was 1945, and in Quebec, the Catholic Church controlled education and social services. Their power in the province at the time is hard to overstate. In the early 1950s, Duplessis realized that federal subsidies paid $2.25 a day for mental patients versus 70 cents a day for orphans. He shortly thereafter collaborated with the church to wrongly classify thousands of orphans, in the terms of the day, as mentally retarded. This decades-long collusion between church and state in Quebec is known as La Grande Noirceur, the Great Darkness.
They were just children and they had their lives stolen.
Quebec will have to reckon with the way that their dead are being treated here, as this is very alarming.
Gatanetta Horn is a longtime activist and currently a spokesperson for a group called the Mohawk Mothers.
Certainly in our communities we have missing children. We've known about that because our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents told these stories to us.
There's a great concern and worry that if no search dogs are brought on the site, human remains will be desecrated and potentially destroyed.
Philippe Blouin is an anthropologist and PhD candidate at McGill University.
This is the official list of the people who were buried there, more than 2,000 people.
The discovery of the mass grave made headlines, and while the remains from that dig have been moved to another site, the orphans and Mohawk mothers suspect there are more on this empty lot earmarked for expansion, right next to where the mass grave was found.